I thought finding out my wife was having an affair was the worst thing that could happen to me. I was wrong. The voicemail she accidentally sent me 8 months after our divorce finalized destroyed everything I thought I knew about the last decade of my life. But it also set me free in a way I never expected. My name is Patrick Hale. I'm 49 years old. I'm a cardiovascular surgeon at a regional medical center in Denver, Colorado. And up until about 2 years ago, I genuinely believed I was one of the lucky ones. Good career, beautiful home in Cherry Hills Village, 2 kids I'd walk through fire for, and a wife I thought was my partner in all of it. I'd met my wife, Lynette, during my residency. She was finishing her MBA, working part-time at the hospital as an administrator. Sharp, funny, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's name and made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. We got married when I was 31. We built everything together. The problem with being a surgeon is the hours. Not just long, consuming. There were weeks when I was at the hospital before sunrise and home after midnight, and Lynette would be asleep. And I'd stand in the doorway of our bedroom for a moment, just looking at her and thinking, I need to do better. I knew I was absent. I knew it even while I was absent. I knew it even while I was doing it, but there was always another surgery, another consultation, another patient who needed me to be sharp and present in a way I sometimes couldn't be at home. I told myself she understood. I told myself we understood. I told myself we had time to reconnect once things settled down. Things never really settled down. About 3 years ago, Lynette started working again. Our youngest, our daughter Chloe, was 11, old enough not to need constant supervision after school. Our son Ryan was already 14 and practically lived in his own orbit. Lynette went back into healthcare administration, took a director position at a wellness center across town. I was proud of her, relieved even, because she'd seemed restless for a while, and I thought having something of her own again would help. For a few months, she did seem happier, more energized. I assumed it was the job. It wasn't the job. The first thing I noticed, though I didn't recognize it for what it was at the time, was her phone. She'd always been casual about it, leaving it on the kitchen counter, charging it on the nightstand, without a second thought. Then one evening in February, I picked it up to show her a restaurant I'd found online, and she was across the room in 3 steps taking it from my hand before I'd even unlocked the screen. Just a reflex. Automatic. I looked at her, and she smiled and said she'd been dealing with some confidential HR stuff at work, and she was paranoid about privacy. I believed her. I believed her for a long time. The night everything changed was a Thursday in March. I'd had a surgery run long, a complicated valve replacement that went 4 hours over the expected time, and by the time I got home, it was almost 9. I texted Lynette that I was on my way, same as I always did. No response. I figured she was putting Chloe to bed. I pulled into the garage and walked through the mudroom into the kitchen, and the house was quiet in a way that felt off. Not peaceful quiet, absent quiet. Ryan's backpack was by the stairs. I could see the light under Chloe's door, but Lynette wasn't in the kitchen, wasn't in the living room, and the light in our bedroom was dark. I walked upstairs and heard her voice before I reached the door, low and soft. She was laughing at something in a way I hadn't heard in years. I stopped in the hallway. I don't know why I stopped instead of just walking in. Something in the tone, maybe. Something that told my brain to wait before my body did something I couldn't take back. I know, she was saying. It's harder when he's home on time. A pause. I'll figure it out. I always do. I stood there in the dark hallway of my own house, listening to my wife tell someone that she'd figure out how to be with them around me. My hand was on the doorframe. I remember that, specifically, the way the wood felt under my fingers, because I was gripping it hard enough to feel my own pulse. I didn't walk in. I went back downstairs, sat at the kitchen table, and waited. When she came down 20 minutes later, she startled when she saw me, just a half second of shock before the smile came back. "You're home early," she said, going straight to the refrigerator. "Surgery ran long," I said. "Who were you talking to?" "My sister." Her sister lived in Portland. They talked maybe once a month. The call had lasted at least 20 minutes that I was aware of, possibly longer. I didn't say any of that. I just nodded and told her I was tired and went upstairs. That night, I lay next to her in the dark and stared at the ceiling for 4 hours. The next morning, I called a colleague of mine, a urologist named Alan Cho, who'd gone through a divorce 3 years earlier and had mentioned offhand that he'd hired an investigator. I asked him for the contact without explaining why. Alan didn't ask questions. He just texted me a name and a number. Her name was Patricia Bowers. She ran a small firm in the Denver metro area, former federal investigator, now specializing in domestic cases. When I sat across from her in her office that Friday afternoon and told her what I'd heard and what I'd noticed over the past several months, she listened without reacting. She wrote things down. At the end, she said, "How sure are you that you want to know?" "Completely," I said. She called me 2 weeks later. I was between surgeries, still in scrubs, standing in a break room that smelled like burned coffee. She told me his name was Joel Barrowick. 41 years old, personal trainer, worked at the same wellness center where Lynette was director of operations. She'd hired him 8 months ago. 8 months. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "Based on what I found," Patricia said, "somewhere between 10 and 14 months. I sat down in one of the plastic chairs and looked at the floor. 10 to 14 months. That was our daughter's 5th grade year. That was Thanksgiving and Christmas and Ryan's first varsity lacrosse game. That was our anniversary dinner in September, when Lynette had cried a little when I gave her the necklace because she said I always knew exactly what she liked. I had paid for that dinner with a credit card that she'd been using to book hotel rooms with another man. Patricia sent me the documentation that evening. I went through it at my desk in the hospital because I couldn't look at it at home. Hotel receipts in Denver, in Boulder, once in Colorado Springs when she told me she was visiting an old friend from her MBA program, credit card charges at restaurants I'd never been to with her, spa bookings on Saturday mornings when I thought she was at yoga. Months of it, layered and organized like a second schedule running parallel to ours. The worst one was a receipt from a hotel 3 blocks from the hospital where I worked. The timestamp was a Tuesday afternoon in October. I'd been in that same building, operating, while she was 3 blocks away in a hotel room. I didn't confront her that night. I spent a week going through our finances instead. Lynette had co-managed our household accounts for years, handled most of the bill payments, the kids' activity fees, the household expenses. I'd never had reason to look closely. When I looked closely, I found things I wasn't expecting. Small withdrawals from our joint savings that didn't match any bill or expense I could identify. Over the past 18 months, she'd moved approximately $38,000 in amounts small enough not to trigger automatic alerts. A few hundred here, 1,000 there, always spaced out. I called my attorney the following Monday. His name is Greg Salter, and he'd done my practice incorporation and a few contract reviews over the years. When I explained the situation, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Patrick, I'm a business attorney. For what you're describing, you need a family law specialist immediately. I'm going to give you a name, and I want you to call her today." The specialist he referred me to was Janet Morse. She was methodical, unhurried, and direct in a way that I respected immediately. When I laid everything out, the affair, the hotel receipts, the financial withdrawals, she said, "We document everything first. You don't confront. You don't change any account access. You don't do anything that signals you know until we have a complete picture." I followed her instructions. For 3 weeks, I came home every night, had dinner with my family, helped Chloe with homework, watched television with Lynette on the couch. It was the most difficult thing I have ever done. More difficult than any surgery. In surgery, I can control what I'm feeling. I can set it aside, because the work requires it. Sitting on that couch next to her watching whatever show she put on, knowing what I knew, required a kind of control I didn't know I had. Ryan figured it out first. He was 16 by then, and perceptive in a way that made me both proud and worried during those weeks. One Saturday morning, he came and found me in the garage where I was reorganizing things I'd already reorganized twice, just to have somewhere to be with my thoughts. He leaned against the workbench the way teenagers do when they have something to say, but aren't sure how to start. "Dad," he said, "is something going on with you and Mom?" I turned to look at my son. He had my jawline and Lynette's eyes, and right then he looked 25 years old. "Why do you ask?" "Because you're in the garage at 8 in the morning pretending to organize stuff that doesn't need organizing. And Mom's been on her phone a lot more than usual, and she gets weird when anyone's nearby when she's on it." He paused. "I'm not stupid." "I know you're not," I said. I set down what I was holding. "There are some things your mom and I are working through. I'm not ready to explain everything yet, but I promise I will when I can." Ryan looked at me for a long moment. "Are you guys getting divorced?" "I don't know yet." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Okay, whatever you decide, I'm on your side." Those 4 words hit me somewhere behind my sternum in a way nothing else had during those weeks. I thanked him, and he went back inside, and I stood in the garage for another 10 minutes, just breathing. I confronted Lynette on a Sunday evening after the kids were upstairs. I'd printed the hotel receipts and the bank statements and Patricia's summary report. I set them on the kitchen table and waited for her to come downstairs. When she walked in and saw the papers, her face went through several things in rapid succession before it settled into something I'd never seen on her before. Resignation. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Long enough," I said. "Sit down." She sat. She didn't deny it. I'll give her that. She didn't try to invent a story or tell me I was misreading things. She admitted to the relationship with Joel. She admitted it had been ongoing for over a year. When I asked about the $38,000, she went quiet. "I needed money that was mine," she finally said. "It was ours," I said, "and you took it without telling me." "I know." "For what? Hotels? Gifts?" She looked at the table. "Some of it. And some of it I was saving." "Saving for what, Lynette?" She didn't answer that. What she did answer when I pressed her was how it started. Online, she said. A fitness community app that she'd joined when she started getting serious about working out. Joel was active in the community. They started messaging. It moved to texting. She said she hadn't planned for anything physical to happen. I told her that was the part that amazed me. Not the lie itself, but how thoroughly people could lie to themselves about what they were doing right up until they were already doing it. I told her to go stay with her mother in Fort Collins. She left the next morning. What I hadn't told Lynette was that Patricia was still working, still watching. What I found out over the next 3 weeks was that Joel Barrick was not, in fact, a man who had simply fallen for a married woman. He had a pattern. Patricia pulled his background with the thoroughness you'd expect from someone who used to work federal cases. Joel had been in 2 previous long-term entanglements with married women in positions of institutional authority. One a hospital administrator in Phoenix, one a school principal in Salt Lake City. Both relationships had ended badly, and both women had ended up leaving their marriages. What made it more complicated was what he was actually doing with his access. Through Lynette, he'd gotten familiar with the vendor relationships and budget structures of the wellness center she ran. 3 of the center's major equipment suppliers had recently been switched to a company that, when Patricia dug into it, turned out to be registered at Joel's home address under a different name. He'd been using Lynette's administrative position to steer contracts toward himself. She either didn't know or hadn't let herself know, which in the end amounts to the same thing. I told Janet Morris all of it. "The contract steering is potential fraud," she said. "The Wellness Center's board needs to be notified, and you want to document everything before you do, because once they know, they'll lock down access immediately." I didn't want to be the one to report it, but Janet was right, that if I didn't, and it came out later that I'd known, there could be liability questions I didn't want near my name. I put together the documentation and delivered it to the center's board chair through Janet. They launched an internal review within a week. Joel's contract relationships were frozen. He was terminated from his trainer position shortly after. That was when Lynette called me, angrier than I'd heard her in years, and told me I had destroyed his livelihood out of spite. I told her to talk to her attorney. The ugliest part came about 6 weeks into the separation, and it came from a direction I wasn't expecting. Lynette filed a declaration with the court claiming emotional abuse. Specifically, she claimed that my emotional unavailability and chronic absence had created a hostile home environment that had caused her significant psychological harm. She wasn't alleging physical anything, just the kind of soft-edge claim that's hard to disprove and easy to make. Her attorney was clearly trying to use it to frame the narrative around money. The week that filing landed, I had to explain to Ryan and Chloe why there was a formal legal process going on. Chloe was 12 by then. She cried. She asked me if I'd been mean to Mom. I told her the truth, which was that I had not always been present the way I should have been, and that I was genuinely sorry for that. But that being absent is not the same as being cruel, and there's a difference between a marriage with problems and a marriage where someone is being harmed. Ryan didn't cry. He looked at me and said, "Mom's trying to make you look bad so she gets more money." I told him not to oversimplify it. He said, "Am I wrong?" I didn't answer. Janet was efficient in handling the claim. She had documentation of Lynette's spending patterns and communications during the period of the alleged emotional abuse, which made it difficult to argue she'd been living in distress. She had records showing Lynette had planned and taken multiple leisure trips during that same period, charged to joint accounts. The claim was challenged and ultimately not pursued. What I didn't expect was Lynette's father. Howard had been my father-in-law for 18 years. He was a retired civil engineer, quiet and precise, someone I'd always respected. He called me 3 weeks into the separation. Not to take sides, he said, but to tell me that he and Lynette's mother had been going over everything she'd told them, and that they were struggling with it. He said, "Patrick, I want you to know that what she did was wrong. Irrespective of whatever else is true, it was wrong and I'm ashamed of it." He didn't offer money. He didn't make grand gestures. He just said what he believed, clearly, without asking anything in return. It was one of the most decent things anyone said to me during that entire period. The divorce was finalized 7 months later. The settlement was straightforward once the financial documentation was complete. Lynette got what she was entitled to under Colorado law. She didn't get extra. The abuse declaration hadn't stuck. The retirement accounts were split by formula. We shared custody of the kids on a schedule that Ryan and Chloe had substantial input in designing, which I think mattered to both of them. I thought it was over. I thought the worst was behind us, and we could just move forward as separated adults who shared children and a history and nothing else. 8 months after the divorce was final, I was at the hospital late on a Wednesday. I'd finished my last case, and I was in my office catching up on notes. My phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. Lynette's name on the screen. That was unusual enough that I noticed it. She almost never called. We communicated through texts and the co-parenting app Janet had recommended. A voicemail felt like a mistake. It was a mistake. She'd meant to call Joel. That was clear from the first 3 seconds. She'd hit my name in her contacts instead of his, and she didn't realize it. And she left a message that was about 4 minutes long and was meant entirely for him. The first minute was mundane. She was talking about plans for the upcoming weekend, where they were going, what she wanted to do. Then it shifted. She started talking about money, specifically about the divorce settlement and how she thought she should have gotten more, and how it was his fault for getting caught with the contract thing, because if that hadn't happened, she might have had more leverage. Then she said something I had to replay twice to make sure I'd heard correctly. She said she'd known about the contracts. She'd known for months. She'd looked the other way because she felt like she owed him something after everything she'd risked for him. She said, "I gave up my marriage for you, and you couldn't even keep your own hands clean." She talked for another 2 minutes about things I won't detail here. But the last thing she said, almost as an aside, was this: "At least the kids are actually his." I had that checked years ago because I wasn't completely sure about Ryan's timeline, but they're his. Small mercies. I sat in my office for a long time after that voicemail ended. Not because of the confirmation about Ryan. Ryan is my son. I had no reason to seriously doubt that. But the fact that she'd had it tested, that she'd lived with that question and answered it privately and never told me, was its own kind of information about who she had been in our marriage. I sat there because of the phrase, "I gave up my marriage for you." Not, "I made a mistake." Not, "I was lonely and things were hard." She had decided. She had made a calculated choice to end what we had, and then she'd spent the last several months acting as though things had simply fallen apart, as though she were a person to whom unfortunate things had happened. The voicemail was the first time I'd heard her be completely honest, and she wasn't even talking to me. I called Janet the next morning and asked whether the voicemail was something I needed to do anything with, legally. She said the divorce was final, and unless I was looking to revisit the settlement, there was nothing actionable. She said I should save it, just to have it, but that I could also simply let it go. I thought about forwarding it to Lynette, letting her know I'd heard it, watching whatever came next. Part of me wanted to do exactly that, wanted her to have to live with the exposure the way I'd had to live with mine. But I thought about Ryan and Chloe, and I thought about what it would mean for them if their mother was in freefall, and I let it go. I deleted it from my phone. I sat for a minute after I did, in the kitchen of the house I'd bought her out of and that now belonged to me and my kids, and I felt something in my chest ease up in a way it hadn't since the night I stood in the hallway and heard her laughing. Because the voicemail didn't break me. It finished something that had been unfinished. I had spent months wondering, in the way you do when a marriage ends, whether I had fundamentally misread everything, whether my years of long hours and missed dinners had been the thing that broke us, and whether a different version of me might have kept it together. That question had been a persistent low hum beneath everything else. I'd answered it as best I could. I knew I'd been absent. I knew I'd taken things for granted. I knew the marriage hadn't been perfect, but I'd never been able to fully shake the possibility that the collapse had been more my fault than hers. The voicemail answered that. She hadn't drifted into something she didn't mean. She hadn't stumbled into an affair and then been swept along by feelings she couldn't manage. She had chosen, and she had known what she was choosing, and she had continued choosing it for years. That clarity was the most unexpected gift she'd ever given me. About a month after I deleted the voicemail, Chloe was helping me make dinner on a Saturday night. Pasta, her recipe, not mine, and she looked at me across the kitchen counter and said, "Dad, you seem different lately." Different how? She shrugged the way 12-year-olds do when they're trying to say something real without committing to it. Like you're not waiting for something bad to happen. "I'm not," I said, and I meant it. Ryan came home from his girlfriend's house around 7, ate 2 portions of Chloe's pasta, and then sat with us watching a movie he'd seen before and she hadn't. He commented on all the parts he liked. It was an ordinary evening in a way that ordinary evenings had not been for a long time. And I was entirely present for it in a way I hadn't always been, even before everything fell apart. That's the thing I came away with. The thing that matters more than the legal settlements and the financial recovery and all the rest of it. Whatever I lost, I had a chance now to be the kind of father, and the kind of man I'd always meant to be, but kept deferring to some future version of my schedule. The crisis had cost me enormously. It had also, unexpectedly, given me my actual life back. Lynette and I co-parent without warmth, but without active conflict. The kids manage it better than I expected. Ryan is at university now, studying business, which surprised me and didn't surprise me at all. Chloe spends alternate weeks between us, and has not, to my knowledge, entirely forgiven her mother, which breaks my heart a little even now. That relationship is theirs to navigate, and I stay out of it. Joel Barrick, as of last I heard through Patricia, is no longer working in the fitness industry in Colorado. What he does elsewhere is not my concern. I work the same hours I always have. That part doesn't change when you're a surgeon. But I come home differently. I come home knowing what the hours cost, and I try to make the hours home worth what the others take. It's not a perfect solution. It's just a more honest version of the same problem. But honest is what I have to work with, and it turns out that's enough. There's something nobody tells you about the moment a long deception finally ends. You expect to feel destroyed. You've been bracing for that, building tolerance for it for months. What you don't expect is the quiet, not silence in the room, but something quieter than that. The absence of a question you'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. That voicemail Lynette sent me by mistake was never meant to give me anything. She didn't intend honesty. She didn't decide to come clean. She accidentally handed me the truth, the way someone dropped something while walking away, not knowing it fell, not knowing someone picked it up. And what I picked up was the end of my own uncertainty. I spent the better part of 2 years asking myself a version of the same question in different forms. Was it me? Did the hours I put into my career hollow something out that I should have been filling at home? Could I have been more present, more attentive, more everything? And would that have changed what she chose to do? Those questions are natural. I think they're probably unavoidable when a marriage collapses. You run the tape back and you look for your own fingerprints on the damage. That's not weakness. That's just what honest people do. But there's a line between honest accountability and punishing yourself for someone else's decisions. I'd crossed that line without knowing it, and I'd been living on the wrong side of it for a long time. What I understood after that voicemail was that Lynette had not drifted away from our marriage the way weather erodes a coastline, gradually and without intention. She had looked at what we had and decided something else was worth more, and she had managed that decision carefully and deliberately for over a year. The loneliness she described, the invisibility she'd felt, I don't doubt those feelings were real, but real feelings don't make calculated choices into accidents. And what she'd done was never an accident. The thing about consequences is that they don't require anyone to dispense them. They accumulate on their own, quietly, out of the basic logic of how actions connect to outcomes. Lynette lost her marriage, her position, her financial security, and eventually the trust of her own children. Not because anyone set out to punish her, but because the choices she made had weight, and that weight eventually landed somewhere. Joel lost his standing and the industry he'd built his life around, not because I wanted to ruin him, but because what he'd been doing couldn't hold up once it was exposed to light. I didn't win anything. I just stopped losing things I should have protected earlier. My time, my attention, my presence in the lives of Ryan and Chloe. If there's anything worth taking from all of it, it's that. Not the legal settlement, not the business I kept intact, not even the clarity that voicemail gave me. It's the fact that the crisis shook me into the present in a way nothing else had managed to do. I'm a better father now than I was before any of this happened. I'm more honest about my limits and more intentional with the hours I actually have. That's not a silver lining. I'd trade the whole experience to have come to that understanding. a gentler way. But you work with what you're given. And what I was given, finally, was the truth. That turned out to be enough to build something real on.